The greatest barrier wasn't the barbed wire fence, but the words Günther couldn't speak. Now, with a wildfire bearing down on the farm, the fate of everyone rested on a diagram he drew in the dust, hoping an American could finally understand his broken English. The California heat did more than just bake the earth. It was curing a catastrophe. Into this inferno, far from the shattered ice and frozen dirt of North Africa, came 21-year-old Günther Weber, expecting to trade one prison for a worse one. Inside the repurposed farm truck, the German prisoners huddled together, their khaki uniforms sticking to their skin, their eyes narrowed against the relentless, hostile glare of the August sun. Among them, Günther, a former communications operator, removed the word killed near El Alamein, expected the inevitable cruelty the propaganda machine promised. He searched the faces of the accompanying guards for malice, but found only exhaustion and professional detachment. But when the doors swung open, the air was thick with the scent of dry hay, hot dust, and something unfamiliar: the rich, heavy sweetness of ripening fruit. The only man waiting was Old Man Miller, a tall, bone-thin rancher who assessed the POWs not with hatred, but with a weary assessment, seeing them only as cheap, necessary labor. The true removed the word death of his operation would be the loss of his crop, not the approach of flames. Yet the air was already thick with the scent of distant burning juniper. The vastness of the American sky was the first silent shock, a blue so open it felt threatening in its sheer scale, a stark contrast to the confining bunkers of the Reich. The sun was not just drying the earth, it was charging a disaster. Miller needed labor, but this year, the fight wouldn't be against weeds or insects. It would be against the sheer, violent force of the Santa Ana winds, which were already brewing in the hills. The very land the men worked was a powder keg waiting for a spark, and the most crucial element, water, was about to fail. Günther felt a strange, detached curiosity about the land he was meant to fear. He studied the dry creek beds and the withered foliage, registering the intense flammability of the environment. Günther's biggest challenge wasn't the sun or the labor, it was the chasm that opened every time he tried to ask for a simple tool. He stood before the silent, oil-stained pump, able to diagnose its failure instantly, yet entirely unable to communicate the repair it needed. Back in his Berlin suburb, Günther was a radio operator, a man of circuits, wiring diagrams, and highly specific technical German. His English, learned through years of studying American radio manuals, was a precise, stilted language of resistors, vacuum tubes, and electrical flow. He could talk to a machine, but not to a man, leaving him trapped in his own expertise and growing frustrated by the lack of clarity. He knew the word Kapazitat, but not the word wrench. This broken, hyper-specific English became a cruel form of isolation, making him seem far less capable than he truly was. Miller saw Günther's slow, fragmented speech as either insolence or profound simple-mindedness. The German was a nuisance to him, a complication he didn't need in a time of labor shortage. But Günther, working on the irrigation lines, was already noticing the fatal flaw in the system. He spent hours tracing the old, sun-baked lines, observing the slight depressions in the dry soil that betrayed subterranean moisture. The main water line, what he mentally labeled pipe section C, was showing corrosive weakness, a silent, bleeding leak near the vital reservoir. He tried desperately to warn Miller, pointing frantically at the water pressure gauge. System pressure unstable. Catastrophic failure, 37% probability. This leak is compromising the structural integrity of the entire supply and wasting thousands of gallons daily. Miller shook his head. Speak English, Weber. You think I got time for riddles? The foreman dismissed Günther's frantic technical babble as a complaint about the heat. The greatest threat to the farm wasn't the enemy outside the wire, but the technical intelligence trapped behind a common tongue. The prophecy of the fire was already upon them and the system needed to be fixed, but the vital warning remained unheard. Just a quick note from the narrator. If you're enjoying uncovering these surprising, forgotten moments where history turns personal, please consider subscribing. It helps us keep telling these powerful stories of courage and unexpected kindness. The Santa Ana winds had turned, and the distant smoke was now pointed like an arrow straight at the valley floor. The great threat, the wildfire that had ignited miles away in the hills, was accelerating its passage toward the Miller farm. The smoke arrived first, a raw, acrid odor carried on the suddenly turbulent air. To the prisoners, this was a terrifying, incomprehensible enemy, a force of nature more chaotic than any artillery bombardment. They remembered the discipline of the German army. This force was lawless and utterly without mercy, spreading without pattern. Local men, pulled from the fields, rushed past the prison compound in old pickup trucks. Their talk centered on acreage lost and the unpredictable path of the fire line. Old Man Miller, however, remained stubbornly fixed on the harvest. He had seen these fires before, and he dismissed the smoke as hill fire too distant to truly menace his livelihood. He ordered the prisoners to double their pace, believing a small, symbolic firebreak of turned earth would be enough to halt any stray embers. He couldn't fathom a fire strong enough to jump the wide, flat expanse of the valley floor, relying on outdated local wisdom. But Miller was wrong. The fire was chewing through thousands of acres of dry chaparral, and the wind had started gusting, pushing the plume closer to the valley floor. Günther, assigned to the furthest reaches of the irrigation line, had a view that was both privileged and horrifying. He could see the landscape's vulnerability in a way the locals could not. He noted the low humidity readings and the speed of the swirling air currents, calculating the fire's rate of spread with grim precision, knowing they were in peril. He saw the continuous, unbroken stretch of bone-dry stalks leading right up to the farm's perimeter. More critically, he saw that the main farm defense, the water system, was critically flawed. The hemorrhage at pipe section C was slowly bleeding the reservoir, removed the word dead, and undermining Miller's entire defense. He tried once again to convey his finding to a passing guard, pointing frantically at the water pressure gauge, but the guard, hearing the German accent and the frantic technical babble, simply shrugged and told him to get back to work. The prisoner knew the farm was defenseless, but no one would listen to the warning delivered in broken English. The military radio, sputtering static inside the main camp office, confirmed the threat. The fire command reported a sharp westward turn in the wind, rapidly closing the gap. Miller's immediate action was flawed, relying on methods passed down through 3 generations. He ordered his men to clear a 20-foot perimeter and rely on the ancient, rusty water tanker. He sent Clara into town to gather additional supplies, a final futile gesture of preparation, wasting valuable time. Günther watched this frantic, disorganized effort with deepening dread. The danger wasn't the fire itself, it was the blind reliance on faulty technology. He knew that the main reservoir was not holding nearly the volume Miller believed, and the critical valve at pipe section C was suffering from severe corrosion. He knew the pipe would burst the moment Miller tried to draw the maximum pressure needed to fight a major blaze. The entire farm was one massive, pressurized bomb of flawed mechanics ticking down to failure. Günther grabbed the foreman's attention, trying to mime a severe leak. Tank. Capacity 40% below nominal. Pipe section C. Undicht. Must seal. The foreman, overheated and focused on the frantic digging, glared back. Speak English, Weber. You think I got time for riddles? We need muscle, not philosophy right now, so get back to shoveling. He dismissed Günther's fragmented technical babble as an attempt to shirk labor. He simply could not process that the enemy standing before him was trying to save his life. The language barrier, usually an annoyance, had become a wall trapping the most vital piece of information. Clara, busy checking the inventory of rations, saw the exchange. She noticed the look of genuine terror in Günther's eyes, a look that spoke to the fear of a professional witnessing catastrophic failure. She was suspicious of the Germans, but she was a practical woman. Her grandfather was staking the entire farm's survival on a rusted-out water truck. She paused, watching the distant glow, realizing her grandfather's stubbornness might cost them everything they held dear. Günther watched Miller walk away, confident in his flawed plan, leaving the vital weakness in the system completely unaddressed. All the POW had managed to communicate was a series of confusing, fragmented technical warnings. The sun began to sink toward the horizon, and the fire's distant orange glow pulsed with frightening rhythm. He knew that the only way to save the farm now was to abandon the language of words and find another way to make the Americans understand. The war's full of moments where humanity breaks through fear, and these stories deserve to be shared. If you find value in hearing these unique historical perspectives, please take a moment to comment below and let us know what you think of Günther's desperate situation. The wind did not just shift. It struck the valley like a thrown hammer, waking the entire camp with a sudden roaring violence. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and the air, previously heavy and still, now screamed through the cracks in the wooden barracks, carrying with it a dense, suffocating cloud of ash and burnt creosote. The barracks rattled so violently that the prisoners feared the entire flimsy structure would tear apart and collapse, crushing them inside. Günther sprang from his bunk, instantly alert. The western horizon was illuminated by a terrifying, undulating orange glow. The Santa Ana winds had pushed the fire over the final ridge, transforming the threat from distant disaster into imminent catastrophe. The farm was plunged into chaos. Guards shouted confused orders, their voices thin against the roar of the wind. Old Man Miller ran out of the main house in his undershirt, frantically trying to start the sputtering engine of the ancient water tanker, its rusty hulk refusing to catch. He was a picture of futile American ingenuity, defeated by neglect and age, desperately pulling the starter cable. The fire was a mindless beast, consuming everything in its path, and it was accelerating, pushed by the gale-force wind. The small 20-foot fire break Miller had dug now seemed like a foolish scratch in the dirt. Günther stood near the pump house, watching the smoke swirl into dense black vortices. His technical mind kicked in, overriding the primal urge to flee. He calculated the minutes they had left, mapping the fire's progress against the landscape's dry fuel sources with chilling speed. The fire was moving too fast for the truck. The only hope was the irrigation system, the very system he knew was critically compromised. If they tried to run the pumps at full capacity, the corroded pipe section C would fail instantly, leaving the farm entirely dry and defenseless. As the guards herded the prisoners toward the main gate, Günther caught sight of Clara. She was dragging fire blankets from the barn, her face streaked with tears and soot, her eyes wide with the realization that her grandfather's lifetime of work was about to be consumed. She looked directly at Günther, and in that fleeting, desperate moment, he saw not the suspicious American taskmaster, but a person facing the loss of everything they valued. He saw a shared human terror that transcended the barbed wire and the uniforms of warring nations. He pulled away from the line of prisoners, knowing he would face severe discipline for the act. Ignoring the shouted commands of the guards, Günther dashed into the pump house, grabbing a piece of charcoal from the cold stove. He had failed to use words, but in a world turned to chaos, he knew that the universal language of mathematics and engineering diagrams might be the last, desperate hope. The ground was the only clean canvas left. Günther dropped to his knees in the dust outside the pump house, the scent of burning juniper and dry pine needles already stinging his nostrils, and began to draw furiously with the lump of scavenged charcoal. The sound of the guards' retreating boots and the approaching fire framed his desperate efforts, amplifying the urgency of the moment. This was not an artist's sketch, but an engineer's urgent manifesto. He rendered the farm's hydraulic system in sharp, precise lines. The main reservoir tank, the thick line of the primary feed pipe, and the critical junction point where the pressure would fail, the compromised pipe section C. He used the technical shorthand he knew, symbols that represented valves, flow regulators, and pressure gauges, a universal language of mechanics that transcended nationality. Beside the compromised section, he wrote the German word that had failed him earlier, but this time he underlined it, gave it context, and paired it with a frantic, bold arrow. Undicht! He looked up, gasping for breath, the fire's roar now audible over the wind. He waited, his heart pounding, knowing his fate rested on one American looking down for just 3 seconds and trusting the diagram. But suddenly, he was not alone. Clara stood over him. She saw the desperation in his eyes, but more importantly, she saw the diagram. She had spent her life on this farm, and though she knew nothing of radio mechanics, she understood the logic of water flow. Her gaze traced the charcoal lines, the tank, the pipe, the junction. Then her eyes locked onto the heavily marked spot, The sheer detail and urgency of the drawing instantly conveyed the severity of the malfunction, bypassing all linguistic confusion. The single, sharp German word, undicht, meaning leaky or unsealed, was rendered in the context of the diagram of the pipe under pressure. In that single agonizing minute, the years of suspicion and the months of language failure crumbled. She realized that Günther wasn't complaining. He had been attempting to relay a critical technical fact. The truth of the failure was finally delivered through the language of engineering. There was no time for discussion. Clara pointed at the drawing, then back toward the pump house. "You know how to fix it?" she yelled over the wind. Günther simply nodded once, his eyes burning with urgent confirmation. Clara ignored the guards and shoved the wrench she was carrying into the German prisoner's hands. She knew the risk she was taking, but the fire offered no safer options. The only option was to bypass the failing pipe and reroute the pressure to the perimeter. Sometimes the greatest act of trust is born not from friendship, but from shared survival. If you appreciate the surprising turns that human history takes, please share this story with someone you know. There is a frantic kind of clarity that emerges when survival is the only objective, washing away all prior rules, prejudices, and uniforms. For Günther and Clara, the path forward was now illuminated by the roaring glow of the advancing fire, demanding they become instantly an unlikely team of engineers. Clara grabbed 3 other German prisoners, men Günther knew had skills beyond simple digging, and pointed them toward the junction point, trusting Günther's urgent nods over her grandfather's frantic, still-flawed orders. Old Man Miller continued to struggle with the useless water tanker, convinced that his tradition-bound method was the only solution. He couldn't see the tiny group working in the shadows, creating their own desperate salvation from the jaws of the fire. The team of German prisoners and Clara ignored him, driven by the pure, life-saving logic of the hydraulic schematic Günther had drawn in the dust. The junction, pipe section C, required immediate action. The only way to save the farm was to completely divert the water pressure from the failing main line and force it into the secondary field irrigation hoses which ran along the western perimeter. They were essentially performing high-risk industrial plumbing with the clock ticking against extinction, relying on pure mechanical instinct. Working by the terrifying, flickering orange light, the German prisoners operated with a synchronous efficiency born of necessity and shared mechanical knowledge. They weren't soldiers, but mechanics, electricians, and farmers. Günther worked the main valve, his muscles straining as he turned the resistant brass wheel, struggling to shut off the feed line. Meanwhile, one of the other prisoners, a former plumber, used the wrench Clara had provided to jury-rig a connection between the primary and secondary lines, using thick wire and shredded burlap to temporarily seal the joint against the anticipated pressure surge. The heat was becoming unbearable, and embers began to rain down. The roar of the fire was deafening now. The men worked through the scorching heat, their faces shining with sweat and grim determination, focusing on the metallic connections under extreme duress. Günther completed the main valve turn, shutting down the failing feed. Then he shouted a command in sharp technical German, indicating they must now open the diversion valve. The men surged forward, applying their combined strength to the secondary valve. The great moment of truth arrived not with a roar, but with a powerful hydraulic sigh, the sound of tons of water being violently diverted into its new makeshift path. The jury-rigged connection held firm, and the water surged through the secondary irrigation hoses, transforming the trickle of field feeders into a defensive deluge. The hoses began to spray a high, arcing wall of water and mist along the western perimeter of the farm, soaking the dry earth and the brittle cotton stalks nearest the firebreak. It was a spectacular, shimmering barrier, a wall of water built by the last-minute ingenuity of an enemy prisoner. The sudden cooling steam provided a brief, precious moment of respite from the infernal heat, a true miracle. The fire reached the property line exactly 3 minutes later. The sight was horrifying, a churning, orange monster that leapt 20 feet into the air. The flames struck the newly wetted earth and the soaking crops, hitting a wall that was unexpectedly resistant. Where the land was damp, the fire hissed and sputtered, forced to crawl instead of leap. The fire continued its passage, but now it flowed around the farm like a terrible liquid current. The heat continued to scorch the air, but the core of the Miller farm, the main house, the barns, and the vital reservoir were spared. The strategic diversion of the water had successfully cut off the fuel source at the critical juncture, turning back the catastrophe. Old Man Miller, who had finally managed to crank the obsolete water tanker to life, stopped the sputtering truck and stared. He had spent his life relying on experience and tradition, but here was proof that an understanding of technical failure had superseded all local knowledge. The fire had been slowed, forced by hydraulic logic to bypass the farm and burn around the edges of the now dampened barrier. He watched the flames retreat, the vastness of the disaster humbling him entirely, rewriting his understanding of value. The sight was a profound moment of realization. The German prisoners, men expected to betray or flee, had risked everything to save the Americans' property. The terrifying reality of the fire had stripped away the lies of propaganda, leaving behind only the simple, universal truth of mutual survival. They were covered in soot and sweat, but they had earned something infinitely more valuable than their small POW wages. The eastern sky bled a quiet, dusty pink over a landscape utterly transformed, not by the triumph of war, but by the near miss of a natural disaster. The roaring wind had subsided, leaving behind a profound silence. The air smelled of wet ash and survival, a memory they would all carry forever, etched into the atmosphere. Günther stood exhausted beside the jury-rigged connection, his uniform blackened by ash. He was technically a runaway prisoner, but when the guards finally returned, their initial anger dissolved into stunned silence. Miller approached Günther not with shouts, but with a stiff, almost awkward reverence. The older man, a creature of habit, stopped a respectful distance away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean linen handkerchief, silently offering it to Günther to wipe the soot from his eyes. The small gesture spoke volumes, a powerful acknowledgement that went beyond policy, signifying profound gratitude. There were no words left to speak. Miller's rough, simple English and Günther's precise, technical German had both failed spectacularly. But the diagram in the dust and the shared, frantic action of the night had communicated a truth deeper than any spoken language. The older man reached out a hand, his gnarled fingers closing firmly around Günther's ash-stained palm. This handshake was the recognition of skill and shared survival. In the face of the fire, they had ceased to be an enemy and a captor. They were simply an engineer and a farmer. They had found the commonality of men fighting a shared enemy, bound by necessity and the common language of technical aptitude. Clara watched the silent exchange, the suspicion she had carried for months finally melting away. She realized that Günther's warnings were not about him avoiding work, but about him trying to save their lives. The essential realization of that dawn was one of dignity. Günther had not been forced to beg for his life. He had earned it through expertise. Miller then did something that defied the rules of the camp and the rigid structure of the military. He turned to the guards, his voice hoarse but firm. "This man saved the farm," he declared, using the English words slowly and deliberately. "He's not going back to the barracks today. He's going to eat, and he's going to sleep. You tell the major that if anyone has a problem, they can come talk to me. This debt is personal, not political, and will be repaid with honor." The American captor had publicly recognized the prisoner's worth over his uniform. Günther, sipping a cup of strong, sweet American coffee Miller silently provided, realized his survival was not an act of mercy, but an act of earned respect. A few weeks after the fire, a dusty army sedan rolled up to the farm, and Günther was summoned to the camp commander's makeshift office. He walked the short distance, expecting the inevitable consequence of his actions. He was still prepared for the military bureaucracy to punish him for violating procedure despite the farm's salvation. Instead of a reprimand, he found the major, Old Man Miller, and Clara waiting. The major explained that Günther's swift technical action had saved property valued in the tens of thousands of dollars. He then presented Günther not with a citation, but with a small, heavy box containing several English-German technical manuals on hydraulics and mechanical systems, books that were virtually priceless to a man whose passion was engineering. For Günther, this gift was more profound than any medal or monetary reward. It was the ultimate recognition of his inner world and his profession. Miller stepped forward next. He announced that he had personally petitioned the military authorities. "This farm," Miller declared, "needs a good engineer more than the Army needs another shoveler." From that day forward, until the time came for his repatriation, Günther Weber was officially designated the farm's technical foreman, responsible for the very systems he had once been forbidden to touch. The irony was profound. The only place in the world where Günther's particular, precise, technical German and his broken English met with complete understanding was on this remote California farm. They communicated through diagrams and gestures, and with Clara through shared jokes. They had transcended the language of war and found the mutual language of work and respect. He knew that these unexpected bonds forged in the heat of survival would last longer than any treaty signed by politicians. As the war ended and repatriation began, Günther carried the memory of the fire, the wrench in his hand, and the heavy weight of the technical manuals. He used his expertise to secure a job helping rebuild the infrastructure of the broken nation. He explained that the greatest barrier between nations wasn't the border or the propaganda, but the inability to speak the truth plainly. And he had found that the truth, when delivered in the universal language of technical necessity, could save lives. Günther Weber's story is a quiet testament to the thousands of enemy prisoners who found that the kindness of ordinary Americans, even the gruff, unsmiling ones, was the greatest shock of the war. His broken English failed him, but his unbroken skill saved him, his hosts, and their home. The war was defined by what nations lost. Peace was found in what two men, one German and one American, built together. If you were moved by this surprising true story of engineering and unexpected kindness, hit the like button and subscribe to join our community. We'll keep bringing you the lost moments where human decency triumphed over war.